In the winter of 1939, while the great powers of Europe were still debating strategy in comfortable offices, a primitive and brutal hell was unfolding in the far north. Little Finland found itself in the path of the Soviet colossus. Stalin expected a 2-week parade to Helsinki, but instead, his Red Army plunged into what the Finns called Talvisota, the Winter War. This was the world's first modern lesson in Arctic combat. In the high latitudes, numbers do not conquer. Only those who understand the frozen terrain and the science of survival can hope to prevail where everything living is meant to perish. The Arctic was far more than a secondary theater, it was a strategically vital frontier that held the keys to the entire war's logistics. In the deep freeze of the north, the ice-free port of Murmansk became the Soviet Union's solitary lifeline for Western Lend-Lease supplies, while the iron ore mines of Narvik fueled the Nazi industrial machine. To control the Arctic was to control the global flow of steel and blood. From the Battle of Suomussalmi to the perilous Arctic convoys, the North became a silent graveyard for those who underestimated the lethal power of the cold. This series will journey through the white fog of these neglected battlefields. We will examine how the Finns perfected Motti tactics, using skis and Molotov cocktails to slice massive tank columns into manageable pockets of ice. We will dive into the freezing Atlantic waters where merchant sailors faced both German U-boats and sub-zero spray that could capsize a ship with weight of ice alone. We will investigate the elite German Gebirgsjäger, mountain troops who tried to seize the Kola Peninsula but were paralyzed by a tundra where even rifle grease froze solid, rendering their weapons useless. Arctic warfare was a test of human endurance pushed to the absolute breaking point. It was a landscape where engines refused to turn, where a minor wound was a death sentence from gangrene, and where the aurora borealis looked down upon a theater of ice and fire. This is the story of the soldiers who fought in the permanent dark of the polar night, proving that in the far north, the environment remains the ultimate commander-in-chief. The Red Army entered Finland with a doctrine built for the open plains of Europe, massive tank formations, heavy artillery, and rigid command structures. But the Arctic forest of 1939 was a different world. In the deep snow of Suomussalmi, the Soviet columns were confined to narrow logging roads, stretched out for miles like giant, slow-moving targets. The Finns, vastly outnumbered but perfectly adapted, responded with a strategy called Motti. Using skis to move silently through the trackless forest, Finnish troops would slice these long columns into isolated pockets, Mottis, and then systematically starve or destroy them one by one. This was the birth of a psychological nightmare for the Soviet soldier. In the sub-zero darkness, they were hunted by ghosts in white camouflage. No one embodied this terror more than Simo Haiha, a humble farmer turned sniper known as the White Death. Working in temperatures as low as -40 degrees, Haiha utilized iron sights instead of telescopic ones to prevent lens flare and fogging. He would even keep snow in his mouth to hide the steam of his breath. With over 500 confirmed kills in less than 100 days, he became a symbol of how an individual soldier, mastered by his environment, could paralyze an entire division. The Finnish advantage was built on logistical simplicity. While the Soviets struggled with frozen truck engines and a lack of proper winter uniforms, the Finns moved on wood. Every Finnish unit was centered around a mobile stove and a tent, allowing soldiers to dry their gear and get warm, even in the middle of a blizzard. They understood that in the Arctic, the greatest killer isn't the enemy, it's the loss of body heat. A soldier who cannot stay dry is a soldier who will be dead within hours. By targeting the Soviet field kitchens and supply trucks, the Finns let the General Winter do the heavy lifting of the combat. However, the White Death tactics could only buy time. Even the most brilliant guerrilla warfare has its limits against a superpower willing to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of men to achieve its goals. By the spring of 1940, the sheer weight of Soviet steel began to crack the Finnish lines. But the lesson had been delivered to the world. A modern mechanized army is a liability in the high north if it cannot adapt to the brutal laws of the ice. As the focus shifted further north to the iron mines of Norway, the war moved from the forest to the fjords, where the stakes were no longer just national survival, but the industrial lifeblood of the Third Reich. By April 1940, the Arctic conflict shifted from the Finnish forests to the jagged fjords of Norway. The target was Narvik, a remote port that served as the primary exit point for high-grade Swedish iron ore. This wasn't just a battle for territory, it was a battle for the survival of the German war machine. Without Swedish iron, Nazi industry would grind to a halt within months. Hitler launched a daring gamble, sending 10 modern destroyers and thousands of elite Gebirgsjäger, mountain troops, into the Arctic Circle to seize the port before the British could react. The Battle of Narvik became a laboratory for high-latitude naval and mountain warfare. The Royal Navy responded with overwhelming force, sending the battleship HMS Warspite into the narrow, ice-choked fjords to hunt down the German destroyers. In the ensuing chaos, the German naval force was completely wiped out, leaving General Eduard Dietl's mountain troops stranded on the snow-covered peaks surrounding the town. For the first time in the war, the seemingly invincible German army was on the defensive, trapped between the freezing sea and the impassable mountains, surviving only by scavenging supplies from their sunken ships. Conditions on the ground were a nightmare of verticality and frostbite. The German mountain troops, though highly trained, found themselves fighting a desperate holding action against a coalition of British, French, Polish, and Norwegian forces. In the Arctic spring, the weather changed every hour, from blinding blizzards to torrential rain that turned the slopes into slush. Every supply crate had to be hauled up the mountains by hand or by mule, and wounded men faced an agonizing descent that often ended in death from exposure before they reached a field hospital. The battle proved that in the Arctic, high ground is a trap if you cannot sustain the men who hold it. Ultimately, the Allies successfully recaptured Narvik, handing Hitler his first major land defeat. But the victory was short-lived. As France began to collapse under the Blitzkrieg, the Allied forces were forced to evacuate the Arctic to save their homelands. The Germans moved back into the ruined port, securing their iron supply for the rest of the war. Narvik left a chilling legacy. It showed that the Arctic could neutralize the world's most powerful navies and turn elite infantry into starving survivors. The focus now turned even further east, to the lid of the world, where a new and even more brutal campaign was about to begin on the road to Murmansk. In June 1941, as the panzers rolled toward Moscow, a separate and far more alien campaign began above the Arctic Circle. This was Operation Silver Fox, a joint German-Finnish offensive aimed at capturing the Soviet port of Murmansk. For Hitler, this wasn't just another target. Murmansk was the lid of the world, the only ice-free Soviet port capable of receiving Western aid. To lead the charge, Germany sent its elite mountain corps Norway, veterans of the Alps and Narvik. They expected to brush aside the Soviet defenders in the tundra and seize the port within weeks. But they were about to encounter a landscape that was not marked on any German map. The German commanders, accustomed to the jagged peaks of Central Europe, were stunned by the Arctic tundra. It was a deceptive wasteland of moss-covered rocks, bottomless bogs, and freezing rivers. There were no roads, only narrow reindeer paths that vanished into the mist. Their specialized mountain equipment, designed for climbing, was useless in the sodden marshland. The Gebirgsjäger found themselves hauling heavy artillery and supplies across miles of unstable ground where every step was a struggle. In the midnight sun of the Arctic summer, there was no darkness to hide their movements, leaving them exposed to constant Soviet harassment. The advance finally ground to a halt at the Litsa River, a natural barrier that became a graveyard of frozen ambitions. The Soviet defenders, better adapted to the terrain and fighting with their backs to the sea, turned the riverbanks into a fortress of stone and ice. Here, the war became static and brutal. Because the ground was too hard to dig trenches, soldiers built low walls of rocks and peat, living in earth holes, where the temperature never rose above freezing. In this environment, the logistical chain simply snapped. The Germans were trying to supply an entire corps via a single, unpaved track that turned into a river of mud with the first rain. Operation Silver Fox became the ultimate example of climatic overextension. The Germans had reached the limits of human endurance, thousands of miles from their supply bases, facing an enemy that grew stronger as the weather grew worse. By autumn, the offensive was officially called off, leaving a permanent frontline that would not move for 3 years. Murmansk remained in Soviet hands, and through its docks began to flow a river of American steel and British aircraft that would eventually drown the Reich. The focus now shifted from the land to the sea, where the bravest men of the war were about to face the suicide run of the Arctic convoys. The conditions on these ships were beyond human comprehension. In the sub-zero temperatures, sea spray would instantly freeze upon hitting the decks, adding hundreds of tons of top-heavy ice to the vessels. If the crews didn't constantly hack the ice away with axes, the ships would simply capsize. In the winter, they sailed through the polar night, a state of total darkness where collisions were constant and navigation was a guess. In the summer, they faced the midnight sun, meaning there was nowhere to hide from the Luftwaffe and the wolf packs of U-boats that stalked the convoys for 24 hours a day. The stakes reached a breaking point with the tragedy of convoy PQ-17. Believing the German battleship Tirpitz was about to intercept them, the British Admiralty ordered the convoy to scatter. Left without protection, the merchant ships were hunted down one by planes and submarines. Out of 35 ships, only 11 reached their destination. This disaster proved that in the Arctic, isolation is a death sentence. Yet, despite the losses, the flow of goods never stopped. Over 4 million tons of supplies, including thousands of tanks and aircraft, reached the Soviet Union via this route, providing the industrial muscle needed for the Red Army's counteroffensives. The Arctic convoys were a testament to the courage of civilian sailors who faced the combined fury of the elements and the Kriegsmarine. They lived in a state of permanent alert, knowing that if their ship was hit, the water temperature would kill them in less than 4 minutes. As the Allied navies slowly gained the upper hand, the German presence in the north began to wither. But before the Arctic War could end, the Red Army launched one final, massive hammer blow to reclaim the north and drive the invaders from the tundra forever. By October 1944, the stalemate on the Litsa River was about to be shattered. The Soviet High Command launched the Petsamokirkans offensive, a massive combined arms operation designed to clear the German 20th Mountain Army from the Arctic once and for all. This was not the desperate, freezing Red Army of 1941. This was a modernized, elite force that had mastered the art of Arctic maneuver warfare. To bypass the fortified German mountain positions, the Soviets utilized specialized amphibious units and thousands of reindeer-drawn sleds to move supplies across the roadless tundra. The German defenders, led by General Lothar Rendulic, faced a nightmare scenario. They were being outflanked in a terrain they had deemed impassable. As the Soviet fleet landed naval infantry behind German lines, the Gebirgsjäger were forced into a chaotic retreat through the Norwegian wilderness. To slow the Russian advance, the Germans implemented a brutal, scorched earth policy. As they pulled back, they burned every house, destroyed every bridge, and blew up every pier in the Finnmark region of Norway. Thousands of civilians were forced to flee into the mountains or hide in freezing caves to survive the passing front. The combat reached its peak in the liberation of Kirkenes. For the German mountain troops, the retreat was a test of absolute endurance. They were fighting in the beginning of the polar night, with temperatures plummeting and the wind howling across the treeless plateaus. Many units were cut off and vanished into the snow, while others fought desperate rearguard actions to allow their comrades to reach the safety of the southern ports. The Soviet advance didn't stop at the border, they pushed deep into Norway, proving that their logistical adaptation, using everything from American Studebaker trucks to traditional sleds, was superior to the rigid German mountain doctrine. The Petsamokirkans operation was the final major land battle of the Arctic War. It resulted in the total liberation of the Soviet North and the collapse of the German strategic position in Scandinavia. The lid of the world had been slammed shut. But as the guns fell silent in the tundra, the soldiers left behind a landscape that was forever changed. The war in the ice was over, but the lessons learned in these frozen trenches would soon become the foundation for a new kind of confrontation, one that would last for the next 40 years. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the Arctic did not return to its former isolation. Instead, it transformed into the most critical strategic vacuum on the planet. The experience of World War II proved that the far north was not just an impassable barrier of ice, but the shortest path between global superpowers. What began as a struggle for Swedish iron ore and the docks of Murmansk became the foundation for a new, far more dangerous game. The Arctic became the central front of the Cold War, where ski battalions and mountain infantry were replaced by nuclear submarines and strategic bombers. The legacy of the Arctic War is etched into the very soil of the high latitudes. The specialized equipment developed for the Finnish CISI units and the German Gebirgsjäger evolved into the modern cold-weather gear used by today's elite special forces. The radar stations of the Arctic convoys paved the way for the WWII line, distant early warning, across the North Pole. We learned that in the Arctic, technology must be as resilient as the people who use it. Today, as polar ice recedes and new shipping lanes open, the lessons of Narvik and the Litsa River are more relevant than ever. The North remains a theater where logistics are life, and where the environment still dictates the terms of engagement. The forgotten soldiers of the Winter War proved that human endurance has a breaking point, but it is much further than anyone imagined. They survived months of total darkness, temperatures that shattered steel, and a landscape that offered nothing but death. Their struggle showed that victory in the far north belongs to those who do not try to conquer nature, but who learn to live within its brutal rules. The Arctic was the first place where the industrial world truly collided with the primordial power of the ice, and it remains the ultimate test of a nation's strategic patience. Today, the silent white expanses of the North are once again at the center of global tension. The ghosts of the reindeer battalions and the merchant sailors of the PQ-17 convoy haunt the same waters where modern navies now patrol. The Arctic War wasn't just a sideshow. It was the birth of a new era of global consciousness. It taught us that the top of the world is not a barrier, but a bridge, and a bridge that must be guarded at any cost. Thank you for watching. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe to the channel for more history without myths.